Rain hammered the empty streets of Florence as a young woman stumbled barefoot across the slick pavement, her soaked dress clinging to her skin like a second betrayal. Streetlights flickered, casting broken halos on puddles as thunder rolled overhead. Elena Rossi, once a rising star in the world of classical piano, now had nothing but fear in her lungs and pain in her steps. Her world had imploded in the span of hours. The man she once trusted, Matteo Ferretti, a city official with clean suits and dirty secrets, had left more than bruises on her heart. He had stolen her music, crushed her spirit, and when she threatened to walk away, made sure no one in Florence would hire her again. She had fled with only the clothes on her back, a bruised wrist, and a warning echoing in her ears. If you leave, you'll regret it. Now, with nowhere to run and no one to call, she collapsed at the edge of the park, rain mingling with the tears she didn't have the strength to wipe away. Her bank account was frozen. Her keys no longer fit the lock to her apartment. Her last friend had stopped answering calls. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. What Elena didn't know was that just yards away, behind the rain-blurred windshield of a matte black Maserati, Marco DeLuca was watching her. A man of shadows and silence. The kind whispered about in courtrooms and corridors, not because he spoke, but because others dared not say his name aloud. It wasn't just the sight of her, drenched, fragile, defiant, that made him stop. It was the look in her eyes. The same look he had seen once in his mother's reflection, moments before she picked up a knife to defend herself against the men who'd destroyed her world. Without a word, he stepped into the downpour, the blood-red leather of his coat gleaming beneath the storm. Elena didn't hear him approach until he was in front of her. She looked up, startled. A stranger. Powerful. Impossibly composed in a storm that was breaking her in pieces. He didn't offer a name. Or ask for hers. He simply looked at her, rain streaking his face like war paint, and said in a voice deep enough to shake the night, "You're mine from now on." She should have run. But her legs were too tired, and her fear of him was smaller than her fear of the man she had just escaped. The moment she let him lift her to her feet, the past began to wash away with the rain. What came next, danger, devotion, betrayal, rebirth, was a future she never saw coming. But it began here, with crimson leather, with a man carved from silence, with 5 impossible words whispered through thunder. And with Elena Rossi finally being claimed not as prey, but as power yet to be awakened. Before we continue, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more exciting stories that you won't want to miss. The scent of jasmine and linen met Elena before her eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she didn't know where she was, the sheets too soft, the silence too heavy, the air too clean. Her body ached with the memory of cold rain and bruised pavement, but her skin was dry now, wrapped in borrowed warmth. She sat up slowly, the silk of her nightgown unfamiliar against her skin, and took in the massive bedroom around her. Cream-colored walls, tall arched windows veiled in soft curtains, and antique furniture that whispered of wealth long accumulated. A knock came at the door, soft but decisive. Before she could respond, it creaked open, revealing a stern-faced woman in a black dress carrying a silver tray. "Good morning, Signorina," the woman said, her Italian accent crisp but polite. "Signor DeLuca asked that you eat something before he speaks with you." Elena hesitated, but the scent of fresh coffee and buttered bread tugged at her stomach like a lifeline. The woman set the tray on a small table by the window and withdrew without another word. Elena's hands trembled as she lifted the porcelain cup, the first sip of warmth spreading through her chest like something dangerously close to comfort. She glanced toward the tall wardrobe across the room, where a fresh change of clothes, slacks, blouse, and a folded sweater waited for her. Everything felt calculated. Not unkind, but precise, as if her presence here had been expected long before last night's storm. It unnerved her. Once dressed, she tiptoed barefoot across the marble hallway, unsure of where she was going, unsure if she was even allowed to wander. The villa was silent, save for the ticking of a distant grandfather clock and the occasional rustle of wind pressing against the tall windows. As she reached a staircase that curved downward like the tail of a sleeping serpent, Two men in suits appeared at the landing. They didn't speak, but they didn't move either, positioned deliberately, like furniture designed to intimidate. Elena stopped, her breath caught in her throat. "I was hoping you wouldn't try to leave just yet." Marco's voice echoed from behind her, low and smooth as ever. She turned, startled, and found him leaning casually against a doorframe, red coat gone, replaced by a dark tailored suit that sharpened the edges of his already imposing form. His hair was slicked back, not a single strand out of place, and he looked at her not with suspicion, but something colder, expectation. "This place isn't easy to leave," he added, not unkindly. "For your safety, of course." Elena didn't answer at first. The guards didn't move, and neither did Marco, both forming an unspoken wall behind and ahead of her. "I don't need protection," she said finally, her voice softer than she intended. Marco pushed off the frame and approached, each step deliberate. "Then consider this a favor," he said, pausing just an arm's length away. "One I don't give lightly." They ate together in a sunlit room lined with glass and marble, where vines crawled up the window panes and the smell of rosemary lingered in the air. The table between them was absurdly large, the distance both physical and psychological. Elena picked at a boiled egg and toast while Marco scrolled through something on his phone. Eventually, he looked up. "Tell me about Matteo Ferretti." The name struck her like a slap. She put the fork down slowly, meeting Marco's gaze across the table. "What do you want to know?" she asked, her throat dry. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "I want to know why a woman like you ended up running from a man like him." So she told him not everything, but enough. That Matteo was charming until he wasn't. That his connections made him untouchable. That she'd seen things she couldn't forget, documents she wasn't meant to see. That when she tried to leave, the threats began, subtle at first, then unmistakably real. Marco listened, his expression unmoving but his jaw tight. "You're not the first woman he's tried to bury," Marco said after a long silence. "But you may be the first he underestimated." Elena blinked, unsure whether it was praise or prophecy. She wanted to ask why he cared so much, why she of all people had ended up in his crosshairs. But his tone changed before she could. "Would you like to see the rest of the house?" He led her through corridors with vaulted ceilings and oil paintings that looked older than the city itself. Room after room revealed curated opulence, a library with books in 5 languages, a wine cellar that smelled of history, a study that seemed too untouched to be used. But it was the music room that stopped her in her tracks. Sunlight spilled onto the hardwood floor, where a black grand piano stood alone like a sleeping animal. Her fingers itched without permission. She stepped forward, hesitant, drawn toward the keys like gravity. Marco watched her quietly from the doorway, saying nothing. She sat, slowly, reverently, and placed her hands above the ivory keys. Her first chord was hesitant, broken. The second, smoother. By the third, something inside her cracked. She played a melody she didn't remember knowing. Something minor, something aching. Her fingers stumbled but pressed on, the sound rising through the room like breath. For a moment, she forgot the storm, the villa, even Marco. She was just Elena again. When she finished, silence filled the space like fog. She turned, startled to find Marco still there, watching from the shadows of the hallway. His arms were crossed, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something almost soft. "Why did you stop?" he asked, voice quieter than before. She stood abruptly, embarrassed. "I didn't mean to, it just—" Marco stepped forward, not to scold, but to close the space between them. "Play whenever you want," he said. "This house could use more music." Elena nodded stiffly, retreating past him before her emotions could catch up. Back in her room, Elena sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window at the endless expanse of manicured gardens. She couldn't decide if she was a guest here or a prisoner, perhaps both. Her instincts screamed not to trust him, but her body betrayed her in subtle ways. The calm in her breath, the comfort of clean sheets, the strange safety she felt when he stood near. She hadn't known how tired she was until now. And that scared her more than anything. That evening, a different woman brought her dinner, quiet, gentle, with kind eyes that didn't ask questions. Elena ate in silence, watching the wind stir the ivy outside her window. She thought about the piano, the way her hands had remembered it before her mind could catch up. She wondered if Marco had really meant it, his offer for her to play again. And she wondered what he saw when he looked at her with that unreadable stare. She didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the house kept her alert, and every shadow outside the windows made her heart race. But nothing disturbed her. No footsteps. No voices. Just the quiet presence of luxury wrapped around her like a velvet trap. When morning came, it brought birdsong and another knock at the door. This time, it was Marco himself. "Get dressed," he said simply. "There's something I want to show you." Elena hesitated. "Why?" she asked. He gave a small smile, one without warmth. "Because I don't like wasting potential." She followed him down the main corridor, then through a hidden panel in the library that led to a lower floor she hadn't seen before. It opened into a hallway lit with low amber sconces, and at the end, a vault-like room full of screens, files, and maps pinned with red thread. Elena froze. This wasn't a home. This was a war room. "Welcome to the part of the house that matters," Marco said. And in that moment, Elena Rossi realized two things. First, she was in deeper than she thought. Second, she didn't want to leave. Not yet. Elena was halfway through her bowl of lentil soup when she heard the knock. She expected the housekeeper, quiet, nameless, sufficient. But instead, it was Marco who stepped through the door, a covered tray in hand, and that same unreadable expression shadowing his face. He said nothing at first, just set the tray down on the small table by the window. His presence made the air thicken. "I thought it might be better if I brought it myself tonight," he said without meeting her gaze. She noticed he wasn't dressed like earlier, no jacket, just a black shirt rolled at the sleeves and charcoal slacks. He looked less like a kingpin and more like a man who hadn't decided whether he was company or captor. Elena didn't respond, unsure what had prompted the change in protocol. Silence filled the room like a third person. He poured her a glass of red wine without asking, then poured one for himself. She noticed his hands, scarred across the knuckles, but steady, deliberate. "You didn't come downstairs today," he said, eyes flickering to hers finally. "I wasn't sure I was allowed," she replied, tone careful. He didn't smile, but there was a shift in his gaze, something acknowledging. They sat across from each other, and she nibbled at warm bread while he sipped his wine. Every so often, his eyes would drift to the corner where the piano sat like a sentinel. After a long pause, he said, "You surprised me yesterday." Elena looked up. "With what?" He nodded toward the piano. "I didn't expect someone running for her life to remember how to play Chopin." "I didn't remember I could until I did," she said softly. Her fingers twitched at the memory. "I stopped playing when Matteo told me it was a distraction. Said music didn't feed the future." Marco's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. She kept going, even though she hadn't planned to. "I started playing when I was 6. My mother taught me. She died when I was 13, but I kept playing. Conservatory, competitions, scholarships, then Matteo." Her voice cracked on his name, just slightly. "He made me choose. Him or the piano. He made a lot of things feel like choices." Marco leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "Control doesn't always come with fists," he said quietly. "Sometimes it comes dressed in concern." Elena blinked at him, startled by how precisely he had put it. He met her eyes now, and the cold in him had softened, not melted, but thinned. "You said you knew things about him," she said, changing the subject before her voice betrayed her again. Marco nodded. "Matteo Ferretti isn't just corrupt. He launders millions through shell companies tied to infrastructure deals, roads, hospitals, housing projects. And he's sloppy. Or maybe just arrogant." Elena sat back, stunned. "How do you know?" He smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Because 2 of those shell fronts used to belong to men in my network. One is dead. The other is rotting in prison." His voice turned flat. "Matteo doesn't just play politics. He picks fights." "Then why am I still alive?" she asked. Marco studied her. "Because you left before he had to choose between silencing you or watching you unravel everything he built." That landed like a weight between them. Elena reached for her wine, hands unsteady. You're not the only one he's hurt, Marco added after a moment. But you may be the only one with proof. Elena frowned. I don't have anything. Not that you know of, he replied. But you were close. Closer than anyone else has been. He stood then, walking to the piano with slow, thoughtful steps. He traced the lid with one hand, then turned to face her. You have two options, Elena, he said. You can run again. Or you can stay here, maybe help me bury him for good. Elena's breath caught. He wasn't offering romance or redemption. He was offering war. Why me? She asked, voice shaking. Why not someone trained for this? Because you're not broken, Marco said plainly. Bent, yes, but not broken. And because I know what it's like to lose a mother, lose a future, and still find a reason to keep your fists up. She stared at him, stunned. My mother died when I was 15, he said, turning his gaze out the window now. She was strong, but she trusted the wrong man to protect us after my father's murder. That man sold us out to the police and to enemies. She was dead a year later. Some people believe in justice. I believe in keeping promises. It was the first time Marco DeLuca had spoken about his past. And Elena realized the same storm she'd seen in his eyes the night he found her had never left. It had just grown quiet. And what promise are you keeping now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned back to her. The one I made to myself. That no one who reminds me of her would ever be left defenseless again. She looked away, overwhelmed, her eyes stinging. I don't know what I want yet, she admitted. I'm still not sure this is safety, or something else. That's fair, Marco said, not pressing. You don't owe me anything. But the door to this house and this fight is open if you decide to walk through it. She nodded slowly. He walked toward the door, stopping just short of leaving. The piano, he said over his shoulder. It suits you. You should keep playing. Then he was gone, and Elena was left with a half-empty glass and a head full of thunder. She didn't sleep that night. Her dreams were tangled strings of music and blood, of Matteo's voice dripping threats and Marco's shadow watching silently. But she didn't run. And the next morning, without thinking, she sat at the piano and played until her fingers ached. She still hadn't said yes. But she hadn't said no either. What do you think Elena should do next? Walk away while she still can, or stay and join Marco's fight for revenge? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like Elena's. The morning air in the villa was cooler than usual, crisp with the scent of cypress trees drifting through the cracked balcony door. Elena stood at the threshold of her room, coffee in hand, scanning the distant gardens where fog clung like a second skin to the hedges. The silence was deceptive. There was always movement here, always eyes she couldn't see watching from somewhere unseen. She had spent 3 days walking softly, observing patterns and memorizing exits, unsure whether she was a guest, a prisoner, or something in between. But something had shifted since Marco's last visit. She no longer felt hunted. Instead, she felt expected, like someone who'd been chosen for a part in a script she hadn't read yet. The villa was beautiful, but behind its carved arches and velvet drapes was a pulse, slow, deliberate, and dangerous. And Elena had decided it was time to know what beat beneath it. She explored the estate with cautious curiosity, never straying too far from the known halls. Most of Marco's men acknowledged her with nods or brief glances, though a few watched her too long, their smiles too thin. One, a gray-eyed man named DeLuca, opened doors for her with surprising gentleness and even offered directions to the library. Another, darker and broader, stared at her as if trying to read her worth in silence, saying nothing. Trust, it seemed, was rare currency here. The library was enormous, paneled in dark walnut and smelling faintly of old paper and leather-bound secrets. She skimmed the spines without interest until something tugged her attention toward a side drawer in the desk. Her fingers moved before her brain did. Inside was a pouch she recognized instantly, her old USB drive, the one Matteo had given her long ago to store receipts and personal files. She had forgotten it in the chaos of her escape, but someone here hadn't. She turned the device in her palm, its worn label peeling at the edges. Heart racing, she tucked it into her sweater and left the room with careful steps. Back in her bedroom, She plugged it into the laptop Marco had placed on the desk the day after she arrived. She expected meaningless PDFs, boring invoices, fake housing permits. But what loaded instead was a single file, encrypted but labeled in a way that made her throat tighten: Fondo Nero, confidential. It took her hours to open it. The code was buried behind a password and then another layer of encryption, but she knew Matteo too well. He reused passwords, especially sentimental ones. Her birthday opened the first gate. A few tries later, Rossini Concerto cracked the second. The file opened slowly, like a vault door creaking wide, and what spilled out was enough to make her sit back in shock. Financial records. Names of politicians. Transfers through shell companies based in Liechtenstein and Panama. Elena scrolled through lines of figures, property deeds, fake investment portfolios tied to Florence city development contracts. Each click felt like digging a deeper grave. When Marco entered unannounced, she didn't hear him at first. "What are you looking at?" he asked from behind, startling her so hard she nearly dropped the laptop. She turned, guilt flashing across her face, but Marco wasn't angry. His eyes were locked on the screen. And then, something rare happened. His mask slipped. He stepped closer, scanning the files with practiced speed. "Where did you get this?" he asked, voice lower now. "Matteo gave it to me months ago," she said. "Told me to keep it safe. I thought it was personal data." Marco's mouth twitched, somewhere between admiration and something darker. "You've been sitting on a landmine," he said. "This is bigger than I thought." Elena frowned. "What does it mean?" Marco leaned in, tapping through the files. "It means Ferrati isn't just corrupt, he's compromised. And if this gets out, a dozen powerful people fall with him." He turned to face her fully. "You understand what you have, don't you?" She nodded slowly. "I didn't, until now." Marco exhaled, a sound that came from deep in his chest. "You're more useful than anyone else here." The words hit her sideways, praise wrapped in possession. She stared at him, uncertain whether to feel honored or objectified. "I wasn't trying to be useful," she said, voice edged. Marco's eyes narrowed just slightly, but he didn't take it back. "That doesn't make it any less true." That night, sleep came in restless waves. She dreamed of water, dark and cold, rising to her throat. She was drowning, lungs burning, limbs heavy, but instead of panic, she felt stillness, as if something within her had already surrendered. Just before the dark closed in completely, a hand broke the surface. Strong. Familiar. Pulling her back into light. She woke with a jolt, sweat dampening her collar. Moonlight bled through the curtains, casting pale lines across the floor. Marco was sitting in the armchair beside the window, unmoving, his silhouette carved from shadow. Elena blinked, unsure if she was still dreaming. "You were crying in your sleep," he said softly. She sat up slowly, drawing the sheets over her chest like armor. "You've been there long?" "Long enough," he replied. "I didn't mean to frighten you." There was no menace in his voice, just quiet observation. Elena didn't ask why he was there. Part of her already knew. "Did you ever drown?" she asked, voice raw. Marco tilted his head, the corner of his mouth lifting just slightly. "Not in water," he said. The silence that followed said everything else. "I hate how much of him still lives in my head," she whispered. "Matteo made me afraid of my own shadow. And now I'm here, wrapped in silk and safety, and I still can't breathe sometimes." Marco didn't move from his chair. "He doesn't deserve your breath. Or your fear." The moon moved higher, silvering Marco's eyes. "You're not who he broke," he said. "You're who survived him." Elena looked away, blinking hard. The stillness between them felt sacred somehow. After a long pause, Marco stood. He walked to the door, but didn't open it. "We're going to expose him," he said, not as a suggestion but a promise. "And if you choose to help, it won't be for me. It'll be for you." She wanted to respond, but her throat closed up. So she nodded instead. He gave her one last glance before leaving the room, silent as smoke. The door clicked shut behind him. Alone again, Elena stared out the window, sleep now impossible. Below, the gardens rustled in the night breeze, the moon casting lace shadows on the path. Something inside her had cracked open, not broken, but shifted. For the first time in years, She didn't feel like a pawn on someone else's board. And maybe, just maybe, she was ready to start moving her own pieces. The sun barely crested the horizon when Elena returned to the encrypted folder on the laptop, her fingers already stained with coffee and determination. Every click of her keys uncovered more rot beneath Florence's gilded politics, names she recognized from newspaper headlines, donation rosters, and gala invitations. Some were men she'd seen smiling beside Matteo at public events. Others were high-ranking officials whose children she once tutored in piano. Their signatures were scattered across falsified contracts and phantom investment accounts, proof of a machine that moved quietly behind the curtain of the city. The deeper she dug, the more the pattern emerged: city land projects overfunded, invoices duplicated, millions funneled offshore through fake firms. One name appeared again and again: Matteo's. Not as a beneficiary, but as a broker. The one pulling strings and greasing palms, hiding behind the respectability of his office. Elena sat back, breathing shallowly, wondering just how close she had come to being part of the system herself. Marco noticed the shift in her that morning, though he said nothing at first. He stood behind her as she outlined the connections with colored string on a corkboard she'd set up in her room. "You're doing better than half my analysts," he murmured, almost amused. Elena shrugged, but the compliment stung again, laced with utility. "This isn't about being useful," she said quietly. "This is about proving I didn't survive all that just to stay quiet." Later that afternoon, Marco asked her to ride with him. "I want to show you something," he said as the black car wound through the narrow streets of Florence, windows tinted, the world outside blurred like a fading memory. She didn't ask where they were going, only that he was driving himself this time, no guards. Eventually, they pulled into an alley that led to a building with high iron gates and no name on the door. The place smelled faintly of varnish and rain. Inside, it looked like a music conservatory: aged wooden floors, sheet music scattered across piano stands, and tall windows that let in golden light. But the practice rooms were soundproofed more heavily than necessary. The staff moved like they were trained in more than hospitality. Marco led her to a small rehearsal space where a young woman sat at a cello, bow trembling in her hand. "This is Clara," Marco said softly. Her husband worked for Matteo. He got too close to something he wasn't supposed to. He died in a car accident. Elena froze. The woman couldn't have been older than 22. In the next hour, she met 3 more survivors, each with their own story of intimidation, betrayal, or loss, all tied in some way to the machine Matteo had built. None of them had gone to the police. "Because justice needs protection," Marco explained. "And sometimes it needs sharper teeth." Elena didn't argue. She understood now that truth alone wasn't enough. As dusk fell, they returned to the villa. A private dinner had been set up in the inner courtyard, lit with soft amber lights and a table long enough for 20, though only 2 seats were used. Elena wore a simple black dress, one of the few things she had brought from her old life. Marco poured the wine himself. The air between them was no longer heavy, but taut like a piano string tuned a little too high. "Why did you show me all of that?" Elena asked, her voice steady. "Because you needed to see you're not alone," Marco replied. "And because I wanted you to know what we're really doing here. This isn't about revenge anymore, it's about reclamation." Elena studied him, her fingers tightening around her wine glass. "What do you really want from me, Marco?" He was silent for a long moment, then set his fork down with a soft clink. "Loyalty," he said. "And, maybe, something more." Elena's breath caught. The words weren't seductive, they were bare, stripped of charm or calculation. It was the honesty that disarmed her. She looked down at her plate, suddenly unsure of what to say. Her heart beat faster, too fast, and for a second she considered leaning across the table. She imagined what it would feel like to press her lips to his, to see if he was as hard to touch as he was to know. But something stopped her. This wasn't love. Not yet. But it was something. They sat in silence for a while, neither needing to speak. The wine softened the edges of the night, and the courtyard lights swayed slightly in the breeze. Eventually, Marco stood and offered her his hand. "Come. Let me show you one last thing." She took it, and together they walked back into the house. As they passed through the main hall, they caught the tail end of a conversation. A guard, young, jittery, was leaning into a corner near the east wing, speaking in hushed tones on a phone. He turned, saw Marco, and dropped the device so fast it clattered to the floor. "Who are you talking to?" Marco asked, voice calm but cold. "And no one, sir. Just my mother," the guard stammered. Elena caught the glance he gave her too long, too waited. Something shifted in her gut. The boy wasn't just lying. He was afraid. But not of Marco. Marco dismissed him with a sharp nod, but his eyes lingered on Elena as they walked away. That wasn't his mother, she said once they were alone again. No, Marco agreed. It wasn't. The chill that followed wasn't from the wind. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. The faces of the survivors stayed with her, Clara's trembling bow, the older man with burn scars who used to be a city contractor. But it was the guard's voice that haunted her most. The fear. The urgency. The betrayal. She sat at the piano for a long time, not playing, just tracing the keys. Marco hadn't asked her to help him tonight. He hadn't reminded her she was useful. And still, she wanted to do more. Not for him. For the truth. Outside her window, a storm was forming. She could feel it in the wind, in the ache in her hands, in the quiet between words. Something had cracked in the structure of this house. And someone was whispering through it. If you were in Elena's position, would you trust Marco with your heart or keep one foot out the door? Drop your answer in the comments and tell us what you'd do next. Your perspective might just shape how her story unfolds. The next morning, Elena woke with purpose simmering beneath her skin. The moment she opened her eyes, she knew the guard's phone call hadn't been an accident. It had been a fracture in the foundation, and she couldn't ignore it. Marco hadn't pressed her for details the night before, but she'd felt it in the air between them. He was waiting to see what she'd do with suspicion. Not run to him. Not hide. But move like someone who understood the rules of the game. She dressed carefully, simple jeans, a cashmere sweater, and no makeup. She wanted to blend in, not distract. In the study, she pulled up a copy of the encrypted files she'd decrypted days earlier and created a decoy folder with a few believable, but ultimately useless, pieces of data. She labeled it with a timestamp and added it to a shared Villa drive she'd recently been granted access to by one of Marco's aides. Then she waited. And watched. Over the next 2 days, she kept her movements routine: meals, walks through the garden, quiet hours at the piano. But at night, she checked the decoy files activity log. The first night, nothing. The second night, she found a timestamp she hadn't made. The file had been accessed just after midnight by someone logged in under Vittorio's ID. Vittorio had always been too polished for a man in Marco's world. He dressed like a diplomat, spoke in clipped, measured phrases, and never once met her eyes directly. She had only seen him smile once, when Marco wasn't looking. Now she remembered the way that smile curled, not with charm, but calculation. And it chilled her. By the third night, Elena placed a second decoy, this time encrypted with a trace program Marco's tech team had shown her during a casual tutorial. She didn't mention it to Marco. She needed to be sure. What she found by dawn made her blood run cold. The IP address wasn't just local. It had pinged off a proxy server linked to one of Matteo's old campaign donors. She stood at the edge of the garden later that morning, eyes trained on Vittorio as he spoke quietly to one of the drivers by the front gate. He moved like someone with nothing to fear. Elena now understood why. In his mind, she was still an outsider. Still just a woman Marco had rescued, not a threat. That would be his mistake. That evening, she asked for a private dinner with Marco, just the two of them, no guards, no staff. He agreed without hesitation, instructing the kitchen to prepare something simple and instructing his team to leave them alone for the night. The table was set near the balcony, where the wind carried the scent of rosemary and rain. The moment they sat, Marco studied her face, the silence between them thick with anticipation. He knew she hadn't asked to dine alone for small talk. "I found something," she said, folding her hands in her lap. "About the leak." Marco didn't flinch, but his wineglass paused midway to his lips. "Go on," he said. Elena met his gaze directly. "It's Vittorio." She laid out the timeline, the decoy files, the server traces, and the digital footprints. Her voice didn't tremble. Marco listened without interrupting, his face carved in ice, only his eyes revealing a flicker of something deeper. When she finished, he leaned back, set the glass down, and said nothing for several long seconds. Then he gave a slow, silent nod. No anger. No outburst. Just that single motion, so sharp it cut the air between them. "Thank you," he said finally. Elena knew he wasn't thanking her for the information. He was thanking her for the way she delivered it. Quiet. Clean. Ruthless. That night, the villa felt different. The air was quieter, heavier. She didn't see Vittorio at dinner, nor during her morning walk. By the time the sun rose, it was as if he had never existed. No one asked questions. No one whispered explanations. The house simply moved on, lighter and darker all at once. Elena understood the message without Marco needing to say a word. He had trusted her word enough to act. She wasn't a guest anymore. She wasn't being protected. She was part of the machine now. Later that night, she sat at the piano, playing softly, the notes melancholic and uncertain. The door opened behind her, footsteps soft but deliberate. Marco didn't speak, just listened. When she stopped, he stepped closer. "Do you regret telling me?" he asked. She turned slowly, meeting his eyes. "No," she said. "Do you regret trusting me?" A long silence stretched between them, full of heat and unspoken things. Then he crossed the final steps and cupped her face gently in his hand. "I don't trust easily," he said. "But I trust you." She closed her eyes, breath catching. "Why?" she whispered. "Because you don't flinch when it matters," he said. "And because when the house was bleeding, you didn't call for help. You stitched it up yourself." He leaned in slowly, giving her the space to stop him. She didn't. Their lips met, not in fire, but in something slower, steadier. The kind of kiss that says "I see you," not just your pain, but your power. And Elena kissed him back, not because she felt owned or obligated, but because she didn't want to be anywhere else. When they finally parted, Marco rested his forehead against hers. "If this complicates things," he started. "Everything is already complicated," she interrupted softly. "This just makes it honest." Outside, the wind rose, stirring the olive trees in the garden. Inside, Elena felt something settle. She wasn't falling. She wasn't running. She was choosing. Elena stood alone on the upper balcony, the evening wind threading through her hair like fingers from a world she no longer belonged to. Below, the lights of the villa glowed like embers in the dusk, each window a whisper of power and secrecy. Behind those walls, orders were given, names were erased, and justice was a matter of precision, not principle. And yet, she had chosen to remain. What unsettled her most wasn't the danger or the secrets, it was the man who made her feel safe inside them. She could still feel the heat of Marco's kiss from the night before, lingering like a bruise she didn't want to fade. It hadn't been possessive or hurried. It had been steady, controlled. Like everything else he did, with one exception, it had felt real. But that truth scared her more than anything Matteo ever had. Because she wasn't sure if she was falling in love or falling under something far more dangerous. Marco found her that evening where the fire pit burned low and the olive trees swayed overhead. He didn't speak right away, just lit a cigar and offered her the space to breathe. When he finally turned to her, his eyes were unreadable. "You've been quiet." Elena shrugged, not meeting his gaze. "I don't know who I'm becoming," she admitted. "And that frightens me more than anything Matteo ever did." Marco didn't flinch. He exhaled slowly, the smoke curling in the fading light like ghostly ribbon. "Then you're paying attention," he said softly. She finally looked at him, her voice just above a whisper. "I kissed you. And I didn't do it because I was grateful or scared or weak. I did it because I wanted to. And I don't know if that makes me strong or just stupid." Marco turned fully now, studying her. "It makes you human," he said. "But don't confuse vulnerability with weakness." There was a long pause. Then, as if sensing the question she hadn't dared to ask, he said, "I wasn't born into this." He dropped his gaze to the flames, shadows carving his features into sharp relief. "My father was a trade unionist. My mother taught literature. When I was 15, both of them were murdered, set up to take the fall for someone else's debt. I watched from the closet as it happened. Elena didn't move, barely breathed. Marco's voice stayed even, but something hollow slipped through it. I swore I'd never beg, never forget, and never trust anyone who hid behind power without paying the price for it. He looked up again. I didn't inherit this empire. I built it from the bones of the men who destroyed my family. Elena felt like something inside her had cracked. She saw now that Marco's silence wasn't indifference. It was armor. Every act of control, every calculated move, it all came from survival. "You're not the man I thought you were," she murmured. "And you're not the woman you were when I found you," he replied. They sat like that for a while, two people suspended between pain and purpose until her phone rang, slicing through the stillness like a knife. She didn't recognize the number. But when she answered, the voice on the other end froze the blood in her veins. "If you want to see your sister alive, you'll stop digging." It was Matteo. Elena stood abruptly, her chair toppling behind her. Marco was at her side instantly. She didn't have to explain, he could hear the threat in her voice, see the terror in her eyes. "He has Chiara," she said, her breath coming too fast. He took her. Marco's eyes turned to steel. "Where?" He didn't say. Just that if I keep going, she disappears. Elena shook, the phone trembling in her hand. "I need to go. Now." But Marco placed a hand on her shoulder, firm and calm. "We do this smart," he said. "And you won't be alone." She shook her head. "She's just a kid, which is exactly why we don't storm into a trap." His tone was quiet but commanding. "This isn't just about you anymore, Elena. It's about everything we've built." Elena clenched her fists, helplessness clawing at her throat. "He knows I care about her. He's using that." Marco's eyes didn't waver. "Then let's make him believe he's winning, while we prepare to take everything from him." Within the hour, the villa transformed into a war room. Marco called in his second-in-command, a grizzled ex-Interpol operative named Donati, and laid out the threat. Maps were spread, calls were made, and a digital trace was launched on the burner phone number. Elena paced the edges of the room, equal parts fury and fear. Every instinct screamed for action, but Marco kept her anchored. "You're not bait," he said firmly when she suggested trading herself. "You're leverage. You have what he wants, and we're going to make him believe he's in control, until he isn't." Elena didn't fully agree, but she didn't argue. She was learning now power didn't roar. It waited. By midnight, Donati had narrowed the trace to an industrial warehouse in Milan abandoned officially, but flagged in Marco's network as a known black site for arms deals and silent meetings. It was Matteo's style, public enough for deniability, hidden enough to bury bodies. Elena insisted on going. Marco didn't argue this time, but his eyes said everything he didn't. He had the chopper readied before dawn. As she stood on the edge of the helipad, wind tugging at her coat, Elena felt a strange calm settle over her. This wasn't the fear of running anymore. This was the stillness before impact. Marco stood beside her, not touching her, but close enough she could feel the weight of his protection. "Whatever happens," she said, "we end this." He looked at her. Not as the woman he rescued, but as the partner standing beside him. "Together," he said. "Smoke or fire." Rain came down in sheets as the helicopter descended onto the rooftop, the blades slicing through the thunder like a war cry. Milan's skyline blurred behind them, glass and steel melting into the storm. Elena pressed her hand against the window, her heart pounding with a rhythm older than fear, something deeper, sharper. Beside her, Marco sat in silence, his red coat draped over his lap like a shroud, face unreadable. Neither of them spoke as the chopper settled with a thud, the moment stretching into breathless inevitability. The rooftop was soaked, wind howling across the concrete, puddles trembling beneath the storm's weight. Floodlights cast long shadows, and at the far end, flanked by two armed men, stood Matteo. He looked smaller than she remembered, less like a monster, more like a man drowning in the empire he'd built. His smile was crooked, smug, but behind it, his eyes flicked from Marco to Elena, calculating. "Bringing him with you?" Matteo sneered. Didn't know you needed a chaperone now. Elena stepped forward first, her heels clicking wet against the roof, chin high despite the wind clawing at her coat. You stole years from me, she said, her voice cutting through the storm like a bell. But you don't get to keep the silence, too. She reached into her bag, pulled out a black folder wrapped in plastic, and tossed it at his feet. Every name, every number, every deal you thought was buried. Matteo didn't look down. He stared at her, his smile faltering. You don't understand what you've done. Elena tilted her head. Oh, I do. That's why I made sure you weren't the only one here. She turned slightly, gesturing with 2 fingers toward the opposite rooftop, where 3 shadowy figures, cameras in hand, stood behind bulletproof glass. The journalists from La Repubblica had arrived 20 minutes earlier, escorted by Donati and Marco's team. And behind them, just out of view, 2 plainclothes officers waited with warrants already signed. Matteo's arrogance cracked. For the first time, his swagger gave way to something Elena had never seen in his eyes before. Panic. You think this proves anything? He barked. These are forged, fabricated by you. Elena cut in. And verified by 6 forensic accountants. You funneled millions through ghost companies tied to public housing funds. You laundered it through the charities I helped you build. And you did it all thinking I'd never leave. She took a step closer, face inches from his. You were wrong. Matteo's mask dropped completely then, and he lunged not at Marco, but at her. Rage in his eyes, spit on his lips, he reached for her like a drowning man grabs at the waves. But he never made contact. Marco stepped between them with such speed it blurred, his hand landing on Matteo's chest, not shoving, just holding. His voice was soft, lethal. You lost the moment she ran. Matteo froze under that voice, under that hand, under the weight of a man who didn't need violence to end someone. His men looked at each other, then slowly stepped back. No one raised a gun. No one spoke. The storm did all the screaming. At that moment, the rooftop door burst open and the officers surged forward, voices raised above the rain. Matteo Ferretti, one of them barked, "You're under arrest for financial conspiracy, abuse of public office, and obstruction of justice." Marco stepped aside. Elena didn't. She watched Matteo's wrists get cuffed, the fury on his face curdling into disbelief. Chiara was escorted up just as the officers dragged Matteo past. Her hair was wet, her eyes wide, but she wasn't crying. Elena ran to her, pulling her into a fierce hug that said everything she couldn't speak. I'm okay, Chiara whispered against her shoulder. He didn't touch me, just scared me. You're safe now, Elena murmured, tears sliding down her cheeks, blending with the storm. It's over. Marco stood a few steps away, letting the moment belong to them. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. But the way he watched Elena said everything: pride, respect, and something else too heavy for the rain to wash away. She turned to him, still holding Chiara's hand. Thank you, she said, for keeping your word. He nodded once. You earned it. The rooftop emptied slowly, the press ushered away, Matteo's men disappearing like smoke, the police fading into the storm. Elena stayed behind as the rain soaked her coat, her hair, her skin, everything she had been before now dissolving under the weight of water. She stepped toward the edge of the rooftop, looking out over the city she had once called home. Thunder rolled in the distance. But inside her, there was silence. Stillness. Peace. Marco approached, his coat draped over one arm, and stopped beside her. You did it, he said. You brought him down. Elena smiled faintly. No, we did. She looked at him then, truly looked. And for the first time, she saw him not as her protector, but as her equal. She reached for his hand. And in the rain, beneath the roaring sky, they stood together. Not rescued and rescuer. Not criminal and witness. But 2 survivors forged by fire, violence, and choice. Elena had come full circle, from prey to partner, from silence to weapon, from ghost to storm. Would you have confronted your past face-to-face like Elena did, or chosen to walk away once you escaped it? Tell us your answer in the comments, and if you haven't yet, subscribe to follow Elena's next step in rebuilding what was taken from her. The headlines came first, bold, unavoidable, a cascade of names and numbers spilling into the public eye like floodwaters breaching a dam. Matteo Ferrati's arrest had opened the gates, and the evidence Elena delivered swept through Florence like wildfire. Politicians resigned. Fundraisers were cancelled. Even the air in the city felt heavier, as though the truth itself had weight now, and everyone was adjusting to it. A week after the rooftop arrest, Elena received the call she knew was coming. The prosecutor's office wanted her to testify. Not behind closed doors, not sealed affidavits or quiet cooperation. They wanted her public. Her face, her name, her words, the survivor who'd cracked the machine open. She sat with Marco in the villa's library, the fire between them softening the stone walls, but not the decision in her chest. If I speak, she said, I lose any chance at anonymity. They'll paint me as a whistleblower, a liar, an opportunist. And if I don't, this all fades faster than it should. Marco didn't interrupt. He just watched her, waiting not to convince her, but to see who she would choose to be. I'll support whatever choice you make, he said finally. But I need you to understand something. He leaned forward, eyes steady. You don't belong in shadows unless you choose them. Elena swallowed. She'd been in the shadows long enough. And she hadn't clawed her way out just to vanish again. She agreed to testify. The media storm was immediate, camera crews outside the prosecutor's office, her name on news tickers, old photos surfacing on social media. But through it all, Marco kept his distance publicly. He didn't hover or intervene, didn't try to control the narrative. He trusted her to navigate it herself, and somehow that made her stronger. He protected her by believing she could protect herself. In the days before the testimony, Elena stayed mostly silent. She didn't rehearse her words aloud. She wrote them down once, then threw the paper into the fireplace and watched it burn. She wasn't going to recite. She was going to remember. The courtroom was silent when she took the stand. Matteo wasn't there. He'd been denied bail and transferred to a secure facility in Rome. But his allies, former colleagues, and the vultures that circled political power were in the gallery, their eyes sharp and skeptical. Elena sat tall. Not defiant. Not broken. Just honest. She told them about the meetings, the threats, the ghost companies. About being erased by a man who called it love. About the way silence had choked her more effectively than any physical chain. And when she finished, the room didn't clap. It didn't need to. There was something better than applause in the air, reckoning. Later that night, she stood backstage at Florence's Teatro della Luna, fingers trembling slightly above the keys of a baby grand. The concert was part of a charity gala, the first public event since her testimony, and her first performance in nearly 4 years. Marco sat in the back, unseen by most, a shadow in the gold-leaf balcony. But she felt him there. The calm in the storm. She began with Debussy light, sorrowful rising. The notes poured from her like breath held too long, and when she closed her eyes, she saw everything. Chiara's terrified face, Matteo's mask shattering, Marco's steady hands, the roof under the rain. The music didn't erase those memories, it gave them shape. And when the final note hung in the air, the audience sat still, breathless, for 3 full seconds before applause erupted like thunder. Afterward, Elena stepped to the mic, her voice calm but steady as she faced the crowd. This music saved me more than once, she began. But too many don't get that chance. She told them about the survivors she'd met, the young woman with the cello, the burnt contractor, the names behind the numbers. That's why I'm building something new, she said. A foundation. A place for survivors of power abuse to heal, to create, to find their voice again, through music. The crowd applauded again, some rising to their feet. Elena didn't mention Marco's name, but she looked to the shadows of the balcony as she spoke her final words. None of this is possible alone, and no one deserves to be saved only once. Behind her, a banner quietly unfurled above the stage, bearing the foundation's name, La Voce Ritrovata, the voice reclaimed. Back at the villa, the celebration was quiet. Marco met her on the terrace with 2 glasses of champagne and no words. They clinked glasses but didn't toast. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said through action. Elena looked out over the hills, the city lights flickering in the distance. It feels different now, she murmured. Like I can finally exhale. Marco set his glass down and turned to her. You could go back to your old life, he said. The university. The performances. The peace. She nodded. I could. But she didn't say she would. You could also stay, he added, more gently this time. Not as a protected thing, but as someone who walks beside me. Elena studied him. Not the power he held or the world he ruled, but the man beneath the armor. The boy who'd watched from the closet. The fire he never let die. I don't know yet, she said honestly. And I think that's okay. Marco nodded, something soft flickering in his eyes. It is. He reached for her hand, not to claim her, but to offer something open-ended. A choice. They stood like that as the wind picked up, rustling through the olive trees. The foundation was real. The testimony had landed. The music had returned. And now Elena had to decide whether to rebuild what was lost or build something entirely new. The first drop landed on Elena's cheek like a whisper. Then another. She stood barefoot in the grass just beyond the villa's terrace, arms crossed over her chest as the wind picked up around her. The clouds above were dark and low, pregnant with the kind of rain that didn't ask permission. But this time, she didn't flinch. She didn't run. Rain soaked into her hair, her shoulders, the hem of her dress, turning the silk to something heavier, something grounding. It wasn't cold, not really. It was clean. A kind of baptism only nature could offer, a letting go of the past written in water. Elena tilted her face toward the sky and closed her eyes. She remembered the first storm, the one that had driven her into the streets of Florence like a ghost looking for a grave. The one that had nearly broken her until a man in a red coat stepped out of a car and offered her 5 words that changed her life. You're mine from now on. At the time, she didn't know if he meant rescue or possession. Now, standing in this storm with her feet in the mud and her soul unshackled, she finally understood. The sound of the villa door opening behind her was almost drowned by the rain, but she heard the steps. Heavy. Certain. Marco joined her without a word, his jacket already off, shirt soaked and clinging to his frame. He didn't ask what she was doing. He just stood beside her, letting the sky claim him too. They didn't look at each other right away. The silence between them was full, not empty, thick with everything that had been survived, said, and forgiven. Eventually, Elena turned her head slightly, just enough to see him from the corner of her eye. When you said, "You're mine from now on," what did you really mean? She asked, voice soft but firm. Marco didn't answer immediately. He blinked rain from his lashes, staring into the gray horizon as if searching for the words somewhere inside it. When he spoke, his voice was lower than usual, threaded with something she hadn't heard from him before. Vulnerability. It means your war is mine. Your pain, your joy, mine. If you'll have me. Elena felt something inside her crack, not like glass, but like soil beneath a seed. And if I don't want to be owned, she asked, her tone challenging, though her voice trembled around the edges. Marco met her gaze finally, and in his eyes there was no dominance, no demand. Just a quiet truth. Then I'll walk beside you anyway. She smiled then, the kind that started in her chest and worked its way to her lips like sunlight after a long winter. Good, she said. Because I'm not looking for a savior. I'm looking for someone who won't flinch when it rains. Marco stepped closer, the storm soaking them both as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. She rose onto her toes and kissed him softly at first, then with the weight of everything unsaid. It wasn't a kiss of possession. It was a promise. When they pulled apart, Elena leaned her forehead against his, her breath steady, her eyes bright. Then be mine too. For a long moment, they simply stood there, hand in hand, heart to heart, as if the rain was an audience and the world had narrowed down to this. 2 people, forged in fire and cleansed in storm. There were no more masks, no more deaths. Behind them, the villa glowed with warm light through its high windows, the only home that had ever felt earned. They walked back toward it slowly, fingers still linked, thunder rolling in the distance like a drumbeat bidding them forward. Elena didn't look back at the sky. She didn't need to. She carried the storm within her now, and it had made her stronger. Inside, the fire was lit, soft and golden, casting long shadows against the stone. Elena paused near the doorway and glanced down at their muddy footprints on the polished floor. She laughed, light and free in a way she hadn't been since girlhood. "Guess we'll need a mop," she said. Marco grinned, a rare sight that reached all the way to his eyes. "Or a new floor." They dried off by the hearth in silence, wrapped in soft towels, sipping warm drinks prepared by the only staff who hadn't asked questions in months. Elena glanced at the piano in the corner of the room, untouched since the concert. "I want to keep playing," she said. "But not for applause. For healing." Marco nodded once, solemn. "Play for the ones who still don't have a voice." She knew what she would do next. The foundation was only the beginning. There were grants to secure, survivors to find, and safe spaces to build, not in secrecy, but in defiance of the silence that had once tried to kill her. She wouldn't just rebuild her life. She'd help others rewrite theirs. That night, Elena stood at the window, watching the last drops of rain streak down the glass. Her hair was still damp, her skin still humming from the cold, but her soul was warm. Behind her, Marco moved through the house like a quiet force, and for once, she didn't worry about what he was hiding. They were building something now. Not a kingdom. Not an empire. A home. And maybe that was the greatest power of all, not wealth, not revenge, but the ability to choose peace without forgetting the war that made it possible. As lightning flashed one last time in the distance, Elena whispered to herself, "I am not what he made of me." Then she turned away from the window and into the man who had never asked her to be anything other than what she already was. Hand in hand, they moved through the villa. Thunder faded. So did the past. What remained was only this: power, peace, and love born from a storm. Thank you for listening to this story until the very end. There's another interesting one on your left screen that I think you'll really enjoy.